The winter wind howled like a wounded animal across the Montana plains, driving snow and ice before it, as Jessamine Miller curled herself tighter against the biting cold. Her threadbare dress offered little protection as she burrowed deeper into the haystack, the last refuge she'd found after walking for days. The blizzard had caught her unaware, forcing her to seek shelter in the dilapidated barn that stood like a lonely sentinel on the edge of nowhere. Jessamine's fingers had long since gone numb, her lips blue with cold as she pulled the meager shawl tighter around her shoulders. She was going to die here, she thought dimly, another nameless victim of the harsh frontier winter of 1876. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd fled Boston to escape death at the hands of her uncle, only to find it waiting for her in the vastness of the Montana Territory. The creak of the barn door startled her from her half-frozen stupor. Heavy boots crunched on the frost-covered ground, and Jessamine shrank further into the hay, heart pounding. She'd heard stories about the men who roamed these parts: outlaws, desperados, men with nothing to lose and no law to fear. "Hello, anyone in here?" The voice was deep, touched with a drawl that spoke of Texas or perhaps further south. Jessamine held her breath, willing herself to disappear into the golden straw. Perhaps if she stayed silent, he would leave. "I saw the footprints leading in," the voice continued. "I ain't looking for trouble. Just checking to make sure no one's freezing to death in my barn." His barn. Of course she would trespass on someone's property. Just her luck. The lantern light swept across the barn, illuminating dust motes and weathered wood before finally falling upon her huddled form. Jessamine blinked against the sudden brightness, raising a hand to shield her eyes. "Well, I'll be," the man said softly. "What in tarnation are you doing out here in this weather, miss?" As he stepped closer, Jessamine could make out his features tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. Dark hair peeked out from beneath a wide-brimmed hat crusted with snow, and his eyes, when they met hers, were a startling shade of blue. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth. "I mean no harm. I just needed shelter from the storm." He knelt beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, smell the leather and horses, and something uniquely male. "You're half frozen," he said, concern etching lines around his eyes. He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders before she could protest. "Thomas Reed," he said by way of introduction. "This is my ranch you've stumbled onto." "Jessamine," she replied, clutching the coat around her. "Jessamine Miller." "Well, Miss Miller, I can't leave you out here to freeze. That wouldn't be right." He studied her for a moment, taking in her bedraggled appearance, the way her cheekbones stood sharp against her pale skin. "I promise you this: as long as I have breath in my body, you'll never sleep cold again." The words were simple, spoken without flourish, but they pierced Jessamine's heart like an arrow. How long had it been since anyone had shown her kindness without expecting something in return? "Can you walk?" Thomas asked, extending a hand. Jessamine nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain. She'd lost feeling in her feet hours ago. She placed her trembling hand in his much larger one and allowed him to pull her to her feet. Her legs buckled immediately, and with a surprised yelp, she tumbled forward. Thomas caught her easily, one arm around her waist. "Easy there," he murmured. Without hesitation, he swept her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "You don't have to," Jessamine began. "House is just yonder," Thomas interrupted. "And I reckon you need to get warm before you catch your death." He kicked the barn door open and stepped out into the swirling snow. The wind hit them like a physical blow, and Jessamine instinctively turned her face into Thomas's chest. He tightened his hold and trudged forward, his boots leaving deep impressions in the fresh snow. Through the blinding white, Jessamine could make out the silhouette of a cabin, light spilling from its windows like a beacon. "Almost there," Thomas encouraged, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The cabin door swung open as they approached, and an older woman stood framed in the doorway, her face lined with concern. "Thomas." "What in heaven's name?" "Found her in the barn, Ma," Thomas explained as he carried Jessamine inside. Half frozen. The warmth of the cabin enveloped Jessamine like an embrace, bringing with it a rush of pain as her extremities began to thaw. She bit back a whimper as Thomas gently set her down in a chair near the roaring fireplace. "Land sakes, Thomas's mother exclaimed. "The poor thing's blue with cold. Thomas, fetch some blankets and put some water on to boil." She knelt before Jessamine, her weathered hands gentle as she removed Jessamine's sodden shoes. "I'm Martha Reed, dear. Don't you worry now. We'll get you warmed up in no time." Jessamine could only nod, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. Thomas returned with an armful of quilts, which Martha promptly wrapped around Jessamine's shoulders. "Thank you," Jessamine managed through chattering teeth. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "Don't think on it," Thomas interrupted, his voice gruff. "No one should be out in weather like this. What brought you to these parts, Miss Miller?" Before Jessamine could answer, Martha clucked her tongue disapprovingly. "Questions can wait, Thomas. The girl needs warming up and something in her belly." She moved to the stove, where a pot of something savory simmered. "When was the last time you ate, child?" Jessamine tried to remember. "Yesterday morning, I think." Martha made a sound of distress and ladled a generous portion of stew into a bowl. "Here," she said, pressing it into Jessamine's hands. "Eat slowly now." The first spoonful nearly brought tears to Jessamine's eyes, rich with beef and vegetables. The stew warmed her from the inside out. She forced herself to eat slowly, though she wanted nothing more than to devour it in great gulps. Thomas settled into a chair across from her, his blue eyes never leaving her face. "Where were you headed?" he asked after a moment. Jessamine lowered her spoon. "West," she said simply. "As far as I could get, running from something?" His tone was matter-of-fact without judgment. "Someone," Jessamine corrected before she could stop herself. At his raised eyebrow, she sighed. "My uncle. After my parents died, I was sent to live with him in Boston. She trailed off, unwilling to speak of the things her uncle had done, the things he had threatened to do. Understanding flickered in Thomas's eyes. "Say no more," he said quietly. "You're safe here." "I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition," Martha interjected firmly. "The storm's likely to last for days, and you're in no condition to be traveling. You'll stay here until you're properly recovered." Jessamine looked between the two of them, searching for deceit or ulterior motives and finding none. "I can work," she offered, "to earn my keep." Thomas smiled then, a slow transformation that softened the hard planes of his face. "We can discuss that when you're not half dead from the cold," he said. "For now, just rest." Later, after she had eaten her fill and the worst of the chill had left her bones, Martha showed her to a small bedroom off the main living area. "It's not much," the older woman apologized, "but it's warm and dry." "It's perfect," Jessamine assured her, overwhelmed by the simple luxury of a real bed after weeks of sleeping wherever she could find shelter. "There's a nightgown on the bed. Should fit well enough. We'll see about getting you some proper clothes tomorrow." Martha patted her hand. "Sleep well, dear." Left alone, Jessamine changed quickly into the offered nightgown, which was indeed a bit large but blessedly warm. She slipped beneath the quilts, sinking into the comfort of a proper mattress. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside she was warm and safe for the first time in months. As sleep claimed her, Jessamine found herself thinking of Thomas Reed's promise. "You'll never sleep cold again." A reckless promise from a man who knew nothing about her. And yet, as she drifted off, she found herself wanting to believe him. Dawn broke cold and clear, the storm having blown itself out sometime in the night. Jessamine woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of voices in the main room. For a moment she lay still, savoring the warmth of the bed and the novelty of waking without fear. A soft knock at the door roused her fully. "Jessamine," Martha's voice called. "Breakfast is ready when you are, dear." "I'll be right out," Jessamine replied, reluctantly leaving the cocoon of quilts. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, which someone had thoughtfully laid out near the stove to dry overnight. They were shabby, but at least they were clean and warm. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Thomas and Martha seated at the table, which was laden with plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits still steaming from the oven. Thomas rose when she entered, a gesture of courtesy that took her by surprise. "Good morning, Miss Miller," he said. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Jessamine admitted, taking the seat he indicated. "Thank you both again for your kindness." "Nonsense," Martha said, passing her a plate. "Now eat up, there's plenty." Breakfast was a quiet affair. with Martha doing most of the talking, filling Jessamine in on the ranch and the surrounding area. The Reed Ranch, she learned, was modest by Montana standards, 200 acres, a small herd of cattle, a few horses, and a garden that Martha tended with pride. Thomas runs most of it himself now, Martha explained, since his father passed 3 years ago. I'm sorry for your loss, Jessamine said sincerely. Thomas nodded his acknowledgement, his eyes briefly shadowed. Pa built this place from nothing. I aim to keep it going, make it grow. And he works himself half to death doing it, Martha added with a fond but exasperated look at her son, especially now with no one to help since Hank left. Hank, Jessamine asked. Ranch hand, Thomas explained. Decided Montana winters weren't to his liking and headed for California last month. Which leaves Thomas short-handed, Martha said with a significant look at her son. Jessamine straightened. I meant what I said last night. I can work. I'm stronger than I look. Thomas regarded her skeptically. Ranch work is hard, Miss Miller. So is traveling alone across half the country, Jessamine retorted. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Reed, and I need to earn my keep if I'm to stay. A slow smile spread across Thomas's face. Fair enough, he conceded. We'll see what you can do once you've had a day or two to recover. I can start today, Jessamine insisted. Martha made a sound of protest, but Thomas held up a hand. How about a compromise? You can help Ma around the house today, get your strength back. Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, we'll see about the outdoor work. Jessamine wanted to argue but recognized the wisdom in his words. Her body was still recovering from the ordeal of the blizzard and the weeks of hard travel before that. Very well, she agreed reluctantly. After breakfast, Thomas donned his coat and hat, preparing to head out to tend to the livestock. At the door he paused, looking back at Jessamine. I meant what I said last night, he said quietly. You're safe here, Miss Miller, for as long as you want to stay. Before she could respond, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. The day passed quickly as Jessamine helped Martha with household chores. Though she had never been particularly domestic in Boston, her uncle had kept servants for such things. She found herself enjoying the simple rhythm of kneading bread dough, sweeping floors, and mending clothes. Martha was an easy companion, filling the silence with stories of her life in Montana, how she had come west as a young bride, following Thomas's father's dream of owning land. It wasn't easy, Martha admitted as they sat by the fire, fingers busy with needlework. Those first few years I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. The winters were brutal, the work never ending, and we were so isolated. She smiled, her eyes distant with memory. But John was determined to make it work, and gradually this place became home. You must miss him very much, Jessamine said softly. Martha nodded. Every day, but I have Thomas, and this ranch is John's legacy. She looked at Jessamine curiously. What about you, dear? Where is home for you? Jessamine's hands stilled. I don't know anymore, she admitted. After my parents died, I never really felt at home anywhere. Martha reached over and patted her hand. Well, you're welcome here for as long as you need, Jessamine. It's been too quiet with just Thomas and me. Thomas returned as the sun was setting, bringing with him a blast of cold air and the earthy scent of livestock. He stamped the snow from his boots and hung his coat by the door, his face ruddy from the cold. Everything all right out there? Martha asked, rising to pour him a cup of coffee. Fine, Thomas replied, accepting the cup gratefully. Cattle are weathering the cold well enough. His eyes found Jessamine. How are you feeling, Miss Miller? Much better, Jessamine assured him. And please call me Jessamine. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Jessamine, then? And I'm Thomas, not Mr. Reed. Only the banker calls me that, and usually when he's about to deny me a loan. Dinner was a hearty affair: roast beef, potatoes, and the bread Jessamine had helped bake that afternoon. Afterward, they gathered by the fire, and Thomas surprised Jessamine by producing a battered copy of David Copperfield. Ma likes me to read in the evenings, he explained, a touch self-consciously. Says it reminds her of when Pa used to do it. Thomas has a fine reading voice, Martha said proudly, just like his father. And indeed, as Thomas began to read, Jessamine found herself captivated not just by Dickens's words but by the rich timbre of Thomas's voice. It was a side of him she hadn't expected, this rough-hewn cowboy who could bring literary characters to life with such feeling. The evening passed pleasantly, and when Jessamine finally retired to her room, she found herself reluctant for the day to end. For the first time in years, she had experienced something close to contentment, a glimpse of what life could be among people who asked nothing of her but her company. As promised, the next day Thomas took Jessamine out to show her the ranch. The morning was clear and cold, the snow gleaming like diamonds under the winter sun. Martha had provided Jessamine with warmer clothes, a heavy woolen skirt, a flannel shirt, and a coat that had belonged to Thomas when he was younger. "It'll swallow you whole," Martha had fretted, "but it's the warmest thing we have." Indeed, the coat hung nearly to Jessamine's knees, and she had to roll the sleeves up several times, but it was wonderfully warm. Thomas had smiled when he saw her, bundled up like a child in 2 large clothes, but there was something in his eyes that made her cheeks warm in a way that had nothing to do with the coat. "First things first," Thomas said as they trudged through the snow toward the barn. "You'll need to learn about the animals." The barn was warm and fragrant with the smell of hay and livestock. Thomas introduced her to the horses, first his own mount, a sturdy bay gelding named Buck, his mother's gentle mare Daisy, and 2 draft horses, Samson and Delilah, used for pulling the wagon and heavy farm equipment. "Can you ride?" Thomas asked as Jessamine stroked Buck's velvety nose. "A little," Jessamine admitted. "My father taught me when I was young, but it's been years." "We'll have to remedy that," Thomas said. "Can't get much done around here without riding." Next came the cattle, a small herd of about 50 head currently huddled in a sheltered pasture near the barn. "Not much to do with them in winter except keep them fed and make sure they have access to water," Thomas explained. "Come spring, we'll have calving to manage and then summer grazing." He showed her the chicken coop, where a dozen hens scratched in the straw, and the small smokehouse where meat was preserved. By the time they had completed the tour, Jessamine's head was spinning with new information, but she felt a sense of excitement she hadn't experienced in years. "It's a lot to take in," Thomas acknowledged as they headed back to the house for lunch, "but you'll learn as you go." "I want to learn," Jessamine said earnestly. "I want to be useful." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "You don't have to earn your place here, Jessamine. You're welcome regardless." Jessamine shook her head. "I can't accept charity, I need to contribute." "It's not charity to help someone in need," Thomas argued gently, "but I understand pride. So yes, you can work, and I'll be grateful for the help. But don't think for a moment that your worth here is measured by how many eggs you collect or fences you mend." Jessamine didn't know how to respond to that. In her experience, people always wanted something in return for their kindness. Her uncle had made that abundantly clear. "Come on," Thomas said after a moment. "Ma will have lunch waiting and she gets cross if we're late." The days fell into a rhythm after that. Jessamine rose early, helping Martha with breakfast before joining Thomas for the morning chores. She learned to milk the cow, feed the chickens, and muck out stalls. Her hands, once soft and pale, grew calloused and chapped, but she wore the changes with pride. In the afternoons, she often helped Martha with household tasks, learning to make soap, churn butter, and preserve vegetables from the root cellar. In the evenings, they gathered by the fire, and Thomas would read or sometimes play the harmonica, a mournful, sweet sound that filled the cabin with warmth. January gave way to February, and still Jessamine stayed. She told herself it was because travel would be foolish during the heart of winter, that she would move on when spring came. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was reluctant to leave the safety and warmth of the Reed Ranch, the quiet companionship of Martha, and the increasingly complex feelings she harbored for Thomas. For his part, Thomas seemed content with her presence. He was patient with her mistakes, generous with his praise when she mastered a new skill, and unfailingly kind. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something warm and contemplative that made her heart beat a little faster. One evening in mid-February, as Thomas read from Pride and Prejudice, Martha's Choice, which he had accepted with good-natured grumbling, Jessamine found herself watching him instead of listening. The firelight played across his features, softening the lines of his face, gleaming in his dark hair. He had shaved that morning, and without the stubble that often shadowed his jaw, he looked younger, almost vulnerable. As if sensing her scrutiny, Thomas glanced up from the book, his eyes meeting hers across the room. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, something unspoken passing between them. Then Martha coughed, and the moment broke, Thomas returning to the book, Jessamine to her mending, both of them a little flushed. Later that night, as Jessamine lay in bed listening to the wind outside her window, she admitted to herself what she had been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with Thomas Reed. The realization terrified her. Love made you vulnerable, gave others power over you. And she had sworn after escaping her uncle that she would never again give anyone that kind of power. But Thomas wasn't her uncle, a voice in her mind whispered. Thomas was good and kind and honorable. Thomas had promised she would never be cold again, and he had kept that promise in more ways than one. Still, the fear remained. What if she was wrong about him? What if he changed once he had her heart completely? And even if he didn't, what did she have to offer a man like Thomas Reed? She was penniless, with no family and no prospects beyond what she could earn with her own 2 hands. No, Jessamine decided as she finally drifted towards sleep. Better to guard her heart, to maintain the friendly distance between them. Come spring, she would thank the Reeds for their kindness and continue her journey west. It was the only sensible choice, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. The first hint of trouble came a week later. Thomas had ridden into town for supplies, leaving Jessamine and Martha to manage the daily chores. He returned earlier than expected, his expression grim as he strode into the cabin. "What is it?" Martha asked, alarmed by his demeanor. "Bad news." Thomas glanced at Jessamine before answering. "Might be nothing," he said slowly. But there was a man in town asking questions. Described a young woman matching Jessamine's description, said she was his niece, run away from home back east. Jessamine felt the blood drain from her face. "He's here, in Montana," Thomas nodded grimly. "Arrived on yesterday's stage, according to Mrs. Perkins at the general store. Said he's been tracking you across the country." Martha moved to Jessamine's side, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. Did this man give his name? "James Miller," Thomas replied, his eyes never leaving Jessamine's face. "He's staying at the hotel in town, telling anyone who'll listen about his poor, confused niece who needs to be brought home for her own good." "He's lying," Jessamine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't care about my welfare, he just can't stand the thought that I escaped him." "You don't have to explain," Thomas said gently. "I could see what kind of man he is, all smiles and charm in public, but there's something cold in his eyes. What do we do?" Martha asked, looking to her son for guidance. Thomas's jaw set in a determined line. "First, we make sure he doesn't find Jessamine. Not many people know she's here. We've been fortunate that the weather's kept us isolated. But if he starts asking around, someone might eventually point him this way." "I should leave," Jessamine said, though the thought filled her with dread. "I've brought trouble to your door." "Absolutely not," Thomas said firmly. "You're not facing this alone, Jessamine. We'll figure something out." The solution, when it came, was both simple and daring. The next morning, Thomas rode into town alone, returning with news that James Miller was indeed still asking questions, offering a reward for information about his niece's whereabouts. "He's spinning quite a tale," Thomas reported as they sat around the kitchen table. "Says you're unstable, that you've had episodes of confusion and paranoia since your parents died. He's playing the part of the concerned guardian, worried sick about your welfare." "And people believe him?" Martha asked incredulously. "Some do," Thomas admitted. "He's smooth, well-dressed, speaks like an educated man, but others are more skeptical. Sheriff Harrison, for one, said something about the man's eyes not matching his smile." "So what now?" Jessamine asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. "I have an idea, but I need to know if you trust me, Jessamine." "I do," Jessamine said without hesitation, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Good." Thomas took a deep breath. "I think we should get married," Martha gasped, and Jessamine felt her own jaw drop. "What?" "Hear me out," Thomas said quickly. "If you're my wife, your uncle has no legal claim on you, no matter what story he spins. As a married woman, you'd be under my protection, not his. But marriage is. Jessamine trailed off, stunned by the suggestion. It would be a name only, Thomas assured her. A legal protection, nothing more, unless. He hesitated, a flush creeping up his neck. Unless you wanted it to be more someday. Jessamine stared at him, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they could both hear it. You would do that. Tie yourself to me legally, just to protect me from my uncle. I would, Thomas said simply. And not just because of your uncle, these past weeks, having you here. It's felt right, Jessamine. I'm not saying we need to rush into anything beyond the legal part, but I think we could build something good together, given time. Martha, who had been uncharacteristically silent, finally spoke. Thomas Reed, are you saying you have feelings for Jessamine? Thomas met his mother's gaze steadily. I am. Martha's face broke into a wide smile. Well, it's about time you admitted it. I've been watching you moon over her for weeks. Ma, Thomas protested, the flush deepening. Jessamine felt as though she had stepped into a dream. Thomas had feelings for her. The same confusing, wonderful, terrifying feelings she had for him. What about you, Jessamine? Martha asked gently. How do you feel about my son? Jessamine looked at Thomas, at his earnest blue eyes and the vulnerable set of his mouth. I care for him, she admitted softly. More than I thought possible. The smile that spread across Thomas's face was like the sun breaking through clouds. Then will you marry me, Jessamine Miller, not just to thwart your uncle, but because we might have a chance at happiness together? Jessamine took a deep breath. This was madness, surely. They had known each other barely 2 months. But in that time, Thomas had shown her more kindness, more respect, and more genuine care than anyone since her parents died. Yes, she said finally. Yes, I'll marry you, Thomas Reed. The wedding took place 3 days later, a quiet affair in the town's small church with only Martha, the minister, and Sheriff Harrison as witnesses. Jessamine wore a dress of Martha's, hastily altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a small bouquet of dried flowers from Martha's winter stores. Thomas, clean-shaven and dressed in his best clothes, waited for her at the front of the church, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked toward him. As they exchanged their vows, Jessamine was struck by the solemnity of the moment, the weight of the promises they were making to each other. I, Thomas John Reed, take thee, Jessamine Elizabeth Miller, to be my lawfully wedded wife. His voice was steady, his hands warm around hers. When it came time for her to speak, Jessamine was surprised to find her own voice clear and sure. I, Jessamine Elizabeth Miller, take thee, Thomas John Reed, to be my lawfully wedded husband. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, transforming what had begun as a practical arrangement into something more profound. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas leaned down and placed a gentle, chaste kiss on her lips there first. The touch sent a shiver through Jessamine that had nothing to do with the February cold. After the ceremony, Sheriff Harrison pulled Thomas aside while Martha fussed over Jessamine's dress. Your uncle's still in town, the sheriff informed them when they were alone, been making quite a nuisance of himself. But this, he gestured to their joined hands, should put a stop to his nonsense. I'll make sure he knows you're legally wed and beyond his reach now. Thank you, Sheriff, Thomas said, shaking the man's hand. They spent their wedding night at the ranch in separate rooms as before. Thomas had insisted on it, determined that Jessamine should feel no pressure to fulfill the more intimate aspects of marriage until she was ready. We have time, he had told her gently. All the time in the world. His patience and consideration only deepened Jessamine's growing feelings for him. In Boston, she had known men who viewed women as possessions, as objects to be acquired and used. Thomas, with his quiet strength and unwavering respect, was unlike any man she had ever met. The confrontation with her uncle came sooner than expected. The day after the wedding, as Thomas and Jessamine were returning from feeding the cattle, they spotted a hired buggy approaching the ranch. Even from a distance, Jessamine recognized the erect posture of the man seated inside. It's him, she whispered, her hand instinctively seeking Thomas's. Thomas squeezed her fingers reassuringly. Remember, you're my wife now. He has no power over you. James Miller was much as Jessamine remembered, tall and distinguished, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of patrician features that commanded respect in Boston society. As he stepped down from the buggy, his cold gray eyes fixed on Jessamine with an intensity that made her shiver despite Thomas's solid presence beside her. "Jessamine," Miller said, his voice smooth as silk. "Thank God I've found you. I've been out of my mind with worry." "Mr. Miller," Thomas said before Jessamine could respond, stepping slightly in front of her. "I'm Thomas Reed, Jessamine's husband." Miller's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Husband? Surely not. There must be some misunderstanding. Jessamine is barely 18 and under my guardianship." "I'm 20, Jessamine corrected, finding her voice. "And I'm married now, Uncle James. The sheriff can confirm it if you don't believe me." Miller's eyes hardened. "This is absurd. Whatever game you're playing, Jessamine, it ends now. You're coming back to Boston with me." "No," Jessamine said firmly. "I'm not." Miller turned his attention to Thomas. "I don't know what she's told you, young man, but my niece has been troubled since her parents' deaths, prone to flights of fancy, running away." "Whatever she's said about me, I believe my wife," Thomas interrupted, his voice like steel. "And she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Miller's facade of concern cracked, revealing the cold anger beneath. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Cowboy. I have friends in high places, influence you can't imagine. One word from me and you could lose this pathetic little ranch." Thomas didn't flinch. "Is that a threat, Mr. Miller?" "It's a reality," Miller snapped. "Jessamine belongs in Boston with her family. Not in this God-forsaken wilderness with some illiterate rancher." Jessamine felt rage bubble up inside her. "You are not my family," she said, stepping forward. "Thomas and Martha are my family now, and I'm staying right here." Miller stared at her, his expression calculating. "Very well," he said after a moment, his voice deceptively calm. "If that's how you want to play this. But remember, Jessamine, I always get what I want in the end." He turned back to the buggy, then paused. "Oh, and Mr. Reed, I'd watch your back if I were you. Montana can be a dangerous place for a man with enemies." They watched in silence as Miller drove away, the buggy disappearing down the snow-covered road. "Do you think he meant it?" Jessamine asked once he was out of sight. "About having influence, about causing trouble for you?" Thomas shook his head. "Men like that are full of hot air. Besides, we've done nothing wrong. You're of age, we're legally married, and this is our home." He squeezed her hand. "Don't worry, Jessamine, we'll face whatever comes together." But as they walked back to the cabin, Jessamine couldn't shake the feeling that her uncle wasn't a man to give up easily. He had tracked her across half the country. He wouldn't be deterred by a simple marriage certificate. Her fears proved well-founded. Over the next few weeks, a series of misfortunes befell the Reed Ranch. First, a section of fence was found cut, allowing several cattle to wander dangerously close to a ravine. Then the water pump for the house mysteriously broke, requiring expensive parts from town to fix. Most alarming was the night they awoke to find the barn on fire, though they managed to get the animals out safely and extinguish the blaze before it spread to the house. "It's him," Jessamine said as they surveyed the damage the next morning. "He's trying to drive us away or force me to go back with him to make it stop." Thomas's expression was grim. "If it is him, he's not doing his own dirty work. Someone local is helping him." The answer came in the form of Sam Wilkins, a drifter who had been hanging around town for the past month. Sheriff Harrison caught him trying to poison the Reed's well and dragged him, protesting, to the jail. "He sang like a canary once I locked him up," Harrison reported when he rode out to the ranch the next day. "Says your uncle paid him $500 to cause trouble, scare you into leaving. Promised him another $500 if he managed to burn you out completely." "That's attempted murder," Thomas said, his face hard with anger. Harrison nodded. "And Mr. Miller will be charged as the instigator. I've sent a telegram to the authorities in Helena. They'll be sending someone to take him into custody." Relief washed over Jessamine. "So it's over. He'll go to prison, most likely," Harrison confirmed. "Attempted murder, conspiracy, destruction of property. The charges are serious. Your uncle won't be bothering you again for a long time, Mrs. Reed." Mrs. Reed. The name still sent a thrill through Jessamine, a reminder of how much her life had changed in just a few short months. That night, after Martha had retired, Jessamine and Thomas sat by the fire, the relief of the day's events still fresh between them. "I still can't believe it's over," Jessamine said softly. "Part of me has been looking over my shoulder for so long, I don't know how to stop." Thomas reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "It'll take time," he said, "but you're safe now, Jessamine. No one's going to hurt you while I'm around." Jessamine looked at their joined hands, then up at Thomas's face, so dear to her now. "I never thanked you properly," she said, "for everything you've done for me." "You don't need to thank me," Thomas replied. "I did what any decent man would do." "No," Jessamine shook her head. "Not every man would have offered marriage to a stranger to protect her. Not every man would have faced down someone like my uncle without flinching. You're a good man, Thomas Reed, and I—" She hesitated, then summoned her courage. "And I love you for it." Thomas went very still, his eyes searching hers. "Jessamine," he said hoarsely, "do you mean that?" "I do," she whispered. "I know our marriage started as a way to protect me, but somewhere along the way I fell in love with you, with your kindness, your strength, your gentle heart." Thomas raised a hand to cup her cheek, his touch feather light. "I've loved you since I found you in that barn," he confessed. "Half frozen and still the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. But I didn't want to rush you, didn't want you to feel obligated." Jessamine leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, cutting off his words. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepening as Thomas pulled her closer, his arms encircling her waist. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, eyes wide with wonder. "I want a real marriage, Thomas," Jessamine said softly. In every way, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That night, for the first time, they shared a bed as husband and wife, their bodies joining in a union as profound and binding as their wedding vows had been. In Thomas's arms, Jessamine found a passion she had never known existed, a connection that went beyond the physical to touch her very soul. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Thomas stroked her hair and whispered, "I meant what I promised that first night. You'll never be cold again, Jessamine, not as long as I live." Spring came to Montana in fits and starts warm days followed by snowstorms, muddy thaws giving way to frosty mornings. But by April, the land was awakening in earnest, and with it came new beginnings for the Reed Ranch. The calving season kept them busy from dawn till dusk, with Jessamine proving herself as capable as any ranch hand. She had a natural way with the animals, a gentle touch that calmed even the most skittish first-time mothers. "You're a godsend," Martha declared one evening as they washed up after a particularly long day. "I don't know how we managed before you came." Jessamine smiled, touched by the older woman's words. "I never imagined this life for myself," she admitted, "but now I can't picture being anywhere else." As spring deepened into summer, the ranch flourished. With the money from selling the previous year's calves, Thomas was able to purchase additional breeding stock, expanding their herd. He also hired a young ranch hand, Jed Parker, to help with the increased workload, allowing Jessamine more time to help Martha with the household and the thriving vegetable garden. In July, as they celebrated Independence Day with a small gathering of neighbors, Jessamine shared her own joyful news with Thomas. "I'm with child," she told him as they stood apart from the others, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. "The baby should come in winter around Christmas." Thomas's face transformed with wonder, his eyes filling with tears as he pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." The news spread quickly through their small community, bringing a flood of well wishes and practical gifts. Martha was beside herself with joy at the prospect of becoming a grandmother, already planning quilts and knitted blankets for the little one. As Jessamine's body changed with the growing life inside her, Thomas became, if possible, even more attentive. He insisted she rest more, hired a local girl to help with the housework, and spent his evenings reading books on childbirth and infant care that the doctor in town had lent him. "You're going to smother me with all this attention," Jessamine teased one evening as he fussed over the placement of a footstool for her. "Just taking care of what's precious to me," Thomas replied, unrepentant. The baby arrived on a cold December night, with snow piling high against the windows of the cabin. Martha acted as midwife, her experienced hands guiding Jessamine through the long hours of labor, while Thomas paced anxiously outside the bedroom door. When the thin, indignant cry of their daughter finally pierced the night, Thomas burst into the room, heedless of propriety, his face alight with a joy so profound it brought tears to Jessamine's eyes. "A girl," Martha announced, placing the swaddled infant in Jessamine's arms. "Healthy and strong, just like her mama." Thomas knelt beside the bed, one finger gently tracing the perfect curve of his daughter's cheek. "She's beautiful," he whispered, "just like you." They named her Grace Elizabeth Reed after both their mothers. She had Thomas's blue eyes and a tuft of dark hair that promised to be as rich and thick as her father's. From her first day, she was the center of their world, the physical embodiment of the love that had grown between them. As winter settled over the ranch, Jessamine often thought back to that first night when Thomas had found her curled up in the hay, half frozen and desperate. How far she had come since then, from a frightened young woman running from her past to a wife, a mother, a woman with roots and purpose. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, Jessamine sat in the rocking chair by the fire, nursing Grace while Thomas read aloud from a book of poetry. Martha dozed in her chair nearby, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The scene was so peaceful, so perfect, that Jessamine felt her heart might burst with contentment. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Thomas asked, noticing her distraction. Jessamine smiled down at their daughter, then up at her husband. "I was just thinking about promises kept," she said softly. "About never being cold again." Thomas set aside his book and came to kneel beside her chair, one hand resting gently on Grace's downy head, the other clasping Jessamine's. "Best promise I ever made," he murmured, leaning in to kiss her softly. "And the easiest to keep." Outside, the Montana winter howled its fury, driving snow and ice against the sturdy walls of their home. But inside, all was warmth and light and love, a sanctuary built not of wood and stone but of promises made and kept, of hearts joined and souls entwined. As Grace drifted to sleep in her arms, Jessamine looked around at the life she had found, at the family she had made, and knew with absolute certainty that she would never be cold again. Not in body, not in spirit, not in heart. Thomas Reed had seen to that. 5 years passed, turning Grace from a baby to a bright, curious child with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. The Reed Ranch had prospered, growing to twice its original size through Thomas's careful management and hard work. They had a proper herd now, nearly 200 head of cattle, and a reputation throughout the territory for quality stock. Jessamine had given birth to a son, John Thomas, 2 years after Grace's arrival. He was a sturdy boy with a shock of dark hair and a laugh that could light up the darkest day. Martha doted on both children, teaching Grace to sew and bake, showing John how to identify birds and wildflowers. The cabin had been expanded, with Thomas adding 2 more bedrooms and a proper sitting room. They had real glass windows now, ordered from back east, and a pump inside the house that brought up water without having to trudge to the well. Small luxuries, perhaps, but ones that made Jessamine grateful every day for how far they had come. News of her uncle reached them occasionally. He had indeed gone to prison for his crimes, though his wealth and connections had reduced his sentence to just 3 years. Upon his release, he had returned to Boston, his reputation in tatters, his influence diminished. The last they had heard, he had fallen ill, his health declining rapidly. Jessamine had made her peace with the past. The frightened girl who had fled Boston was gone, replaced by a woman who knew her own strength, who had built a life of meaning and purpose on the Montana frontier. On a warm summer evening, as they sat on the porch watching the children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Thomas took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Happy?" he asked, a question he still posed from time to time, as if reassuring himself that she had no regrets. Jessamine squeezed his hand, watching as Grace triumphantly captured a firefly in a jar, John clapping his small hands in delight. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "You?" Thomas smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. "I found a half-frozen woman in my barn and got a family, a partner, and the love of my life. I'd say I'm the luckiest man in Montana territory." As the stars emerged in the vast Montana sky, Jessamine leaned her head against Thomas's shoulder, content in the knowledge that some promises, once made, could last a lifetime. She had never slept cold again after that fateful night, wrapped in the warmth of Thomas's love and the life they had built together. And she never would.